really a pleasure to be here, and I chose a nice provocative title to get some of you in the room, and now it'll be up to me to defend Wall Street, defend the financial sector more generally, and that will become clear what I mean by in defense of Wall Street and what I mean by sort of. I am from a very argumentative Jewish family from New York, and I'll take it as a personal insult if you don't interrupt me frequently. Or at least I won't know what's going on unless you do. So there'll be time for questions at the end, but there's also time for interruptions throughout. So finance is powerful. Finance influences who can start a business and who can't. Finance influences who can expand a business and who can't. Finance influences whether parents can borrow to live in a community that's conducive to the cognitive and non-cognitive development of their children, or whether they can't. Finance shapes whether an individual can get training that she needs in order to change a career path that she wants to go on. Finance influences whether workers who may never get a loan, may never know what a credit default swap is. Finance influences whether those workers look for work in a dynamic economy where firms can enter and firms leave and they're bidding for the services of workers, or whether that worker looks for work in a stagnant environment where there's essentially one firm or two firms that set the wages and the conditions for employment. So finance very much influences the contours of people's economic horizons. From this perspective, finance is quite powerful, very powerful from a social perspective as well. Does finance and economic opportunities flow to people with the best ideas? And when I say finance and credit, I'm really going to use that very much synonymously with opportunities. So does finance and economic opportunities flow to those with the best entrepreneurial ideas and energy, or do they flow to the privileged, to those who are already wealthy, to those with a lot of political connections? That obviously has implications for income distribution. Are you closed off from getting a loan simply because you're poor or not part of the elite? And the same thing, how much demand is there for you as a worker? So that in the context of finance, I'm going to think very broadly about finance in terms of how it shapes people's economic opportunities. So this is one view. It's not the only view. This is, I'll call this the finance matters view, for lack of a better term. And from this perspective, if the financial sector, and that should be part of this slide, if the financial sector is functioning well, then there's not a tension between economic growth and economic opportunity in the distribution of income. Because it becomes economic growth comes about in this context from the financial sector identifying the people with the best projects, the best ideas, the best innovations, not simply the people with the most accumulated wealth or the people from privileged backgrounds. In this context, it's that finance is going to shape not just the people who operate in the financial sector or the business people that get loans. This is going to be the constant theme throughout the talk, that even if people don't know anything about the financial sector, their lives are influenced by the functioning of the financial sector. The point being that even if you don't care about the financial sector, what you care about is poverty, and what you care about are the disenfranchisement of lots of groups in society, you should really be thinking about the financial sector as one element in what explains differences in different economies and what can be done to influence change over time. So depending upon how you view finance, if you take this finance matters view, then financial regulations become a first-order issue Okay, not just to be shunted aside to the Federal Reserve down the street or to the financial regulatory body in a variety of countries. If you take this finance matters view, then financial regulations become very important in terms of economic development, in terms of economic growth, in terms of technological innovation, in terms of expanding entrepreneurship, in terms of employment opportunities, and all the rest. And financial regulations in that context will affect income distribution, the distribution of economic opportunities, the level of poverty, whether there are improvements. And so from that perspective, financial regulations are not just about crises, which they've come to be about in the last decade, and they were about that before that as well. Financial regulations really become about economic development and growth and income inequality and all the rest. And I'll also talk about this in the context of discrimination against particular groups too. Now, of course, there's an alternative view, and this alternative view I'm going to call the casino view. And here, this is very much a view. It's popular around the world. People don't like bankers. There's a sense in which bankers simply, borrow some money from issue deposits, get money from everybody, and allocate it to the already rich, and then take a very, very large cut from this intermediation process. I think people would tend to define or describe the incomes of bankers as unwarranted and certainly undeserved. That's one view. There's a sense in which the rich people, they come, they place bets in the financial sector like a casino. If they win, they win. And if they lose and the casino collapses, we all lose. This is very much a view of the operation of the financial sector as well. These two things are not necessarily inconsistent because the financial sector can be powerful and yet function very poorly, in which case we'd be in this view. There's a quote that I like from the second president of the United States. Banks have done more harm to the morality, tranquility, and even wealth of this nation than they have done or ever will do good. Now, this view is very popular in Hollywood. And for those of you, this is sort of the movie that you'll think of. It would be The Wolf on Wall Street. For those people look more like this. This older, better movie also had the same theme. But this view is not just in Wall Street. This is a view that's very popular in regulatory agencies around the world. There's a fear that we're very fearful of the financial sector because of what it might do. Certainly the Europeans have taken on that view very much, and many academics as well. Now, this casino view, taken to the extreme with a little bit of exaggeration to make the point, this casino view will push toward, by the way, there's some seats up here. The casino view will push toward a different policy conclusion. And its policy conclusion is protect us. Okay? Protect us from the financial sector because if it collapses, it's going to bring us down. Okay? That's different from the view with the finance matters perspective. The finance matters view, we need a well-functioning financial sector. Therefore, we can't just be protected from the financial sector failing. We need a financial sector that operates well to get all these improvements in welfare that we want. So these two views are not just academic. These two views matter for the types of approaches that are taken with respect to policies. Okay, so that's about all the conceptual stuff that I can take as somebody who does empirical work. Now I want to see what the evidence says, and maybe you feel like that too. So I know that there may be quite a bit of difference in terms of statistical backgrounds. So I'll present to you some work. I'll try to do it in an intuitive way. If you have some questions, just ask, okay?
I have a question.
Go for it.
I just go back to the previous slide. Are you trying to say that it's either or? I see both, concepts coexisting.
I think that's I think that that's perfectly fair, except if you view the finance matters view simply says that the financial sector is very important. And so then the issue becomes if it functions well, where what I mean very specifically by functioning well means that it provides a number of services. One is a well-functioning financial sector will try to screen and identify the best firms and households, not just the most wealthy or politically connected. A well-functioning financial sector, once it mobilizes savings and it allocates those savings to those firms and households, will then monitor to make sure that they're being used well and not being siphoned off by executives or others. And a well-functioning financial sector will also provide mechanisms to diversify risk, which will allow entrepreneurs to take on worthwhile risks for all of us and then create demand for workers, as opposed to a financial system that doesn't allow people to diversify risk and then will limit the types of entrepreneurial activities that are taken. So I'm kind of using this as an opportunity to repeat, but I am going to answer the question. The flip side, and this is I think what you're getting at, and you're exactly right, is that when a financial sector doesn't operate very well, it won't provide those functions. And what this means is that capital, credit, and hence opportunities will flow to a narrow, privileged group. Narrow and privileged defined in many different, it could be based on wealth, it could be based on political connections, it could be based on an ethnic group having control, which would be linked up to both politics and wealth. But in that sense, you neither get the economic growth and you can curtail the economic opportunities. And that is a little bit close to the casino view. When I kind of go all the way to the casino view, and I think you're pushing on something exactly right, which is a little bit of a spectrum here, then it's not necessarily an either or. But when I push toward the casino view, I'm also pushing toward a view of finance that its primary function seems to be from that view that it fails, that there's a crisis, and that finance is associated with a deep reduction in economic output and a surge in poverty. And if you have that view, then you're not taking this view that finance is extremely important for for economic prosperity more generally. And so it does then alter, not one or the other, but it alters your view of financial regulations and policies. So, but thank you. It's not an either or, but I'm setting it up like that to make the differences a bit more dramatic. Okay, so I'm going to go through a bunch of different methodologies in terms of assessing this view. And as we go, we're going to step through different cuts of what I mean by economic prosperity. Okay, so prosperity, economic growth might be part of that, but economic growth is not the only part of that. Income distribution and poverty might also be things that we would consider in terms of prosperity, and also the degree to which how economy, a society, deals with discrimination against minority groups. So I put this here because it might be helpful, but essentially what I'm going to do is on the left-hand side, on your left-hand side, I'm going to try to explain something. And the first thing I'm going to try to explain is growth. And I'm going to try to explain it with some measure of financial development. And I'll start out with some that you're really not going to like. At least I don't really like them. And then we'll go to others that maybe you like a little bit better. And then I'm going to try to control for lots of things about the economy. And I'll start out doing things across countries. And then I'll start focusing just on one country where methodologically it's cleaner. And I'll tell you what I mean by methodologically cleaner. Good? So I want to see more finance, do you get more growth? Controlling for all of these different things. How rich you were, the economy was beforehand, the inflation rate, fiscal deficits, the black market premiums, revolutions and coups, political assassinations, and all the rest. Okay. So what this graph shows is this shows the relationship on the vertical axis, economic growth. So this will be one observation per country over this long period. And on the horizontal axis, this is a measure of financial development. So I have to tell you what I mean by financial development. Economic growth is output per person. Financial development is credit by financial institutions that are allocated to the private sector. So what's excluded are things like credit by the private sector, by banks, that go to the government, or credit by banks that go to state-owned enterprises. So this is the intermediation that takes place, or banks, and they're the main financial institution in most countries in the world, collect resources, savings from individuals, and then allocate it. And we're just looking at how big is that as a share of the economy. This is not a great measure. Why isn't it a great measure? It's not a great measure because I just got done saying that what a lot of theory suggests, and the argument that I was making, is that the financial sector does things. It goes out and it screens potential borrowers and households, and then it monitors how people use that money, and it has to mobilize resources from disparate households around the world, and it provides risk diversification. And I'm not measuring any of that. I'm just measuring how big is the financial sector, where big is how much is going to private firms and households. And the reason is that it's very difficult to get a measure of how well a financial system is screening and get a number for that is comparable with Bolivia and Slovenia and the US and Taiwan. So we're going to use this aggregate, and then we're going to try to do better. Now the numbers here are a little bit peculiar because what's going on in this picture is we're controlling for all of those other things I mentioned. So for those of you who are kind of doing econometrics, it's basically the relationship between growth and finance when you run this multivariate regression projected into this two-dimensional plane, finance and growth. Good? Okay, so now for the answer. The answer is the thing goes up and it's significant, which means that countries with better developed financial systems, given the measure that I just indicated to you, have faster economic growth over very long periods of time. Please.
So you measure the size of the financial sector relative to the size of that economy.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And then not, because otherwise you have these
Exactly.
totally, you're normalizing that. And then what are the units of that? 2 and 4.5? What is that?
So these are not useful units because they're residuals. Because what I have to do here is I am I'm examining the relationship between growth on the left and finance on the right, while controlling for many, many other features of the environment. And so it doesn't have a natural measure. But if you were right, but if I were to tell you what the measures are, they range from very, very low levels, close to 10%. Many countries with very underdeveloped financial systems, and you can get Taiwan, you can get over 1. You can get very large numbers. The U.S. is not so large because this is a measure that focuses on bank credit, and the U.S. is a market-based system, tends to have both well-developed markets and well-developed banks. We can talk about those differences later. Exactly. Okay. So that's a pretty big deal. And this doesn't tend to show up for like many measures. It's not like, oh, you just stick openness to trade in and you're going to get this result. In fact, if you stick openness to trade in, you're not going to get this result. Okay. So then the issue may come up, what about income inequality? This is also something that's very important. Maybe what's happening is that countries with better developed financial systems basically just allocate all the money to the rich, average growth goes up, but it's not doing anything for the poor. That would be a general source of concern. And over the last 20, 30 years in the U.S., this has been a feature of the U.S. economy, putting the financial sector aside, where growth has gone up, but growth has gone up because the rich have done really well, not because everybody has done well, and certainly not because those at the lower end of the income distribution went well. But that tends not to be the result in general. There's more noise going on, and the data is a lot worse for income inequality. But here you tend to see a downward sloping line, which means that better developed financial systems, given the imperfect measure that I have, is associated with a reduction in income inequality. Okay? And when I examine income inequality, I'm controlling for average growth. You can control for average growth or not control for average growth. So this is not coming about because of something weird going on with growth. This is an independent relationship between finance and income inequality. Okay? And you sort of see the U.S. over here. So the U.S. has a very well-developed financial system. But after controlling for other things, the U.S., in terms of income inequality growth, is much higher than projected from its financial system, which means that there are certainly other things that affect income inequality over time besides how well-developed the financial system is. So we're going to then get to this question, because this is going to go against, I think, will go against your intuition. It's like you don't like this, right? It's like, you kind of feel grown comfortable feeling like the financial sector is evil, and how I'm sort of presenting you something that the financial system is causing income inequality to go down. Okay, so this might not resonate. I'm going to keep coming back to this again and again because it didn't resonate with me either. But what you should have in mind is this story I started out with, which is very, very few people become entrepreneurs. Okay? If you look at and I'm not talking about entrepreneurs in the sense of a one-person business where somebody is selling hot dogs. I'm talking about an entrepreneur as somebody who is hiring other people. Very few people. In the U.S., this is less than 3% are in businesses where they're hiring other people. So in order to get something like this can't be that everybody became an entrepreneur. So I want you to go back to what I said earlier and think about you're looking for work. Are you looking for work in your town and there's one company? Or are you looking for work in a town where there are several companies, they're competing with each other, and there's always the possibility of a new company entering? And that's where we're going to see where this is coming from. It's that it's affecting not the entrepreneurs. It's affecting the entrepreneurs, but if we're going to get this to affect income inequality for the country as a whole, it can't come about because everybody's becoming an entrepreneur. It has to come about through the labor market, and that's what we're going to see. Okay. This is another type of a way of looking. Yeah?
Right. So when you talk about income inequality based on law of private credit, as a share of private credit sector, doesn't it depend on access? For example, Korea and Vietnam have similar ratios, but in South Korea, the access to banking is universal, while in Vietnam, it's a quarter of adults. So in that case, even though they have higher measures, they're not a good measure of credit inequality.
So in terms of access to credit, we have to be careful here what we're talking about. So this is an argument I get into a lot with somebody named Asla Demirjokunt, and she's a very high up person at the World Bank and has kind of pioneered a lot of the work on access to finance as being important. So access to finance can mean two types of things. And again, they're not mutually exclusive. Two types of things. One is that if a person has a good idea, she has more access would mean that she has a better chance of getting the capital she needs to start her business, even if she doesn't have a lot of wealth or political connections or power. That's one form of access. Another form of access means that lots and lots of people have a bank account. Okay, or lots and lots of more and more people get little loans. And the story that I'm telling is much more about the first, because that's what's going to affect the labor market. The second one might also be very important, but I'm a little bit more skeptical about that one as of yet. But that's to be determined. But that's not. But maybe go back to the broader point that you're making is just looking at private credit to GDP doesn't tell me anything about that. It's just sort of a broad indicator that we sort of know is associated with better functioning financial systems that's available for lots of countries from 1960 to the present, but it doesn't matter anything exactly that we want to. And then this is, I'll show some other graphs, and you should bring it up again because it's very important to keep reminding us of that. Okay. What this does is this looks at the income growth in each country of those people who are in the bottom 20% of the income distribution. Okay, so it's how fast are the low-income people's incomes growing? So that's the dependent variable. That's what we're trying to explain. That's what's on the horizontal axis. We got the same poor measure of financial development on the other axis. Okay. And so again, what you see here, and this also controls for average growth. So what this graph is telling you is that finance disproportionately is associated with faster growth among the poor. It's disproportionate. Okay? It's not just that finance boosts everybody's income, or finance is associated with more rapid growth. It's that finance is disproportionately associated with faster growth of lower income people. Okay, because I'm controlling for average growth. Okay? And again, the US sort of stands out here. Maybe not in a positive way, I don't know. Okay. And this is what's going to make this point further about how this must be happening. Okay? So this is looking at extreme poverty. So this is the proportion of the population that lives on less than $2 a day. And I do this one because we're concerned about the extremely poor. It also gives a hint about what must be going on in terms of how this could possibly be coming about. This is not coming about because the people who are making less than $2 a day are all of a sudden opening up large businesses and becoming richer, right? So it tends to focus your attention on it must be something else. And that's why I keep coming back to the labor market. It could be. I'm not saying that they're not people that don't open up businesses, but it suggests that that's not, to me, it suggests that's not where the action is coming from. Okay, so that was that, to remind myself. It's sort of a question to you, remember why, but it's really a question to me, remember why. So let's do a different test. And so many people don't like cross-country regressions and comparisons. How can you compare Haiti and Switzerland, et cetera? So, and you want an econometrics, you want some natural experiment, a shock that improves the financial sector, and then you want to see what happens. And you can't kind of tell all the countries to say, stop. We're going to randomly assign to every country in the world the different financial sector and then see what happens. But we can almost do that in the US. And so we can have a little natural experiment in the US. Okay. So a little history. So the interesting thing about the US banking system is that it was based on individual states. Individual states regulated their own banks. And this started out because states wanted a way to raise revenue. And one of the ways in which the states raised revenue is they would sell a banking license to somebody. Okay? But then if you want to sell another banking license to another person, you have to do something to make sure you protect the monopoly power of people buying these banking licenses. Because if everybody can buy one, the price will go down, and you want the price to be high if you're the state and you're trying to raise revenues. So what they did was they said, okay, you can have a bank in here. And then if you buy a banking license, you can buy a bank over here in this other town. And in many states, this was an extreme, that you can have one building, no branches. And you can have one building, no branches. And if you keep doing that, it may be an effective way to get lots and lots of revenues for the states, and that's what they did. But you also then have lots of little localized monopolies. So you looked at the US, and it had over 30,000 banks. And people said, wow, that must be a really competitive banking system. But no, it's not a really competitive banking system. It's because every little bank had its own little monopoly. Now, once you get that system, where every little bank has its monopoly, those banks are going to lobby very, very hard to maintain those protections. Right? So everybody then at some point realizes, you then have, this kind of takes place in the 19th century, everybody kind of goes forward, you then develop a better tax system, and there's income taxes, and then people say, man, this is a crazy system. But I get all of this money in campaign contributions, I'm not going to change this crazy system, the next person can do that. So these protections took on two forms. One is for the state as a whole. The state is like, absolutely no way another bank is coming into this state. So that was one. And then the other was the one I described, where there were strong limits on the ability of banks, even within a state, to move geographically. Okay? And this kind of stays like this until the 1980s. This really was a good old boys network in everything that terminology is everything that term is supposed to convey. It was like that, and it did restrict opportunities and things. Okay, the end of history. It's supposed to be a little funny. Yeah, maybe not too funny, I guess. Okay. So what changed? Was it the fact that people said, wow, this is really inefficient. We have really high interest rates on loans, and there's low amount of interest rates that's paid on deposits. There's no competition, or there's little competition among banks. This is very, very inefficient. We should change it. No, of course, that didn't change it. What changed it was technology. So this is the ATM machine. And so what happens is I'm over here, and I have my bank, and Bill's over there, and he has his bank. And I want to get some of Bill's customers. Now, just to be clear, my bank, for regulatory reasons, was here. They can't go anywhere. If one of Bill's customers wants to borrow from me, that's okay. But it turns out that banking markets tend to be very local. Most lending takes place within 5-10 miles of the bank. But it was not illegal to do that. It was just illegal for me to move over to Bill. So once the ATM machine was invented, and let's say I buy an ATM machine, and I go over there, and I kind of plunk it down next to Bill, and I kind of send advertisements over here, not through the internet, so this would be like paper mail over there, and not even an 800 number, I think, at that point. But anyway, set up the ATM machine there. Now, this is the US. What is the first thing that Bill does? So not any other country, it's the US. So it's like, what is Bill going to do? He's going to sue, exactly. So, and this is what happened. So Bill sued and said, okay. Bill said, it's a branch. Doesn't look like a branch, but that's the same thing as a branch. Okay? And this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically refuses to hear it and says, like, the lower court's decision stands that it's not a branch. Okay? So now we have more competition. So now Bill sets up his ATM machine near me. So this disrupts the system. Okay? And eventually what happens in this state is Bill and I become less and less inclined to contribute to politicians to maintain those regulations. Okay? Now, it still would be better if I had a branch, a person there to get clients. But the ATM machine kind of whittles away at things. Okay, so then what happens is, and it turns out to work out just perfectly the way you'd expect it, is so I used to live and work in Rhode Island, and Rhode Island is this big. Okay, and so having a restriction on not being able to open up a bank here, not being able to open up a bank there is pretty small. And an ATM machine essentially eliminates that. So you'd expect a state like Rhode Island, the politicians to give up, and there to be get rid of these restrictions on geographic locations of banks, and then there would be more competition. Then you take Montana. Montana's really big. Okay, and so it may take much longer before the ATM machines erode the importance of regulatory restrictions on geography. And that's exactly what you see. So you sort of see this timing of different states deregulating at different times. So now we're not going to have a measure of bank credit to GDP, and we're not going to get a direct measure of how well the banks are screening, although other people do work on that. But now we get a shock to the competitive pressures, the contestability of banking markets, and then we can use that as a shock to the efficiency of the banking system. Because from other work, we know that what happens, the interest rate on deposits goes up, the interest rate on loans goes down, the profitability of banks goes down, but they get better at screening because you don't see an increase in loan defaults or bank failures. Good? So now we can use that as a shock to a banking system, a country, a state's banking system getting better. And what's nice if you're just like statistics and things like that is that this happens in different states in different years. And so we have a common shock to the banking systems of 50 different economies, and we can evaluate what happens. It's not perfect, or we can talk about some of the imperfections, but it's methodologically more appealing than the big, broad cross-country work. Okay, so now this zero is when a state removed restrictions on this ability of banks to set up branch networks within the state. So I can set up a branch near Bill. Bill can set up a branch near me. So year zero could be a different calendar year. It is a different calendar year. So you have some states that start in 1980, and this goes all the way up until 1995. It's not till 1995 that this whole thing is eliminated at the country level. Okay? So zero, different calendar year for different states, but in all states, it's when they remove this impediment to competition. Good? Okay. You can control for many things. So this is you can have a dummy variable for every state, and you can have a dummy variable for every time period. So you remove some trends. And what you see here, and it's the removal of those trends that makes this thing flat. It's not that growth in the U.S. is flat over this period. It's growth in the U.S. is flat over this period if you take out changes in growth in this period each year. Okay? But you see a pretty remarkable jump up, right? I mean, that's pretty remarkable, I think. You get more competition, growth goes up in the country. So this is output per person, where output is measured output per the state level. Good? Okay. So there's two things, a couple of differences here. One is my research assistant did this, and I did this. Okay. So what you have here is this is the entry of new firms, the rate at which new firms enter this state's market. And again, you can see when there's more competition, more firms enter. So this is consistent with this good old boys network. It's like, okay, I'm a bank. I always lent money to Billy Bob. And Billy Bob, I don't know if Billy Bob is the best firm or not the best firm, but I've always lent money to Billy Bob. No one's competing with Billy Bob. No one's competing with me. And Billy Bob and I, we play golf. That's it. But now what's going to happen is Bill is going to come, and he's going to look around. He may not lend to Billy Bob. He might lend to a person with a better idea. I know that that's what Bill's going to do. Okay, he's going to come and try to lend to better people. Those people succeed, and it puts my people out of business. That forces me to reevaluate Billy Bob, right? And therefore, I have to lend to not necessarily my golfing buddy or the person that's in the Kiwanis Club or whatever it is. I have to lend to the person with the best idea. And that means there's going to be a more efficient allocation of resources, and there's going to be this entry of new firms. Okay, so it's consistent. Now, if that's true, we should see Billy Bob going out of business, right? Potentially. And this, too, is what we see. Okay, this is the exit of firms. Okay, you see more turnover. It's not that, and this is why the argument with Asla, it's not that you see everybody becomes an entrepreneur. Okay? Billy Bob is now working for the better person. Okay, so now we can also look at inequality. So you can measure the distribution of income within each state. And now we can ask the same questions that we asked at a cross-country level. We can now ask within the context of the US with this nice shock to the competitiveness of the banking system in the state. Good? Okay, now, again, we know that income inequality in the US went up. I'm not arguing with that. What I'm showing here is that let's eliminate what's going on with income inequality in the US as a whole over this period and ask the question, given that all of that is taking place at the country level, as each individual state receives this shock that increases the competition in its banking industry, what happens to inequality in that state relative to what's going on in the country as a whole? Good? And you see that it falls. Okay, now it could fall because all the rich people got poorer. It could fall because the poor people got richer. So, okay, so then we got to look at a little bit deeper. And so what we can do is we can look at, this is a nice thing about looking at the US, is that you have a lot of data. We can look at the poorest 5%, the next poorest 5%. So we can look at each group of individuals in the state and ask, what happened to the growth rate of incomes of the poorest 5%? What happens to the growth rate of incomes of the people between 5 and 10? What happens to the growth rate of incomes of the people between the 90th percentile and the 95th percentile? Good? So then we can say, we can look at when the banking shock hits and increases competition in a state, what happens to the growth rate of the incomes of every single group? Okay? And then we can see, what happened? And that's what this shows. And what this shows is the dark is statistically significant and the light blue is not statistically significant. And so what it's saying is that this improvement in the competitiveness of the banking system had a disproportionately positive impact on those at the lower income distribution. This clearly does not have to always happen. There can be changes in finance that don't yield this result. But in the US over this time period, this improvement in state banking systems increased the demand for workers at the lower end of the income distribution. Please.
I'm a bit confused as to why that's a defense of finance versus just a defense of competition. Because other firms out of finance, out of banking, if industries theoretically became more competitive, it should lead to the same outputs.
Yeah. What's driving the competitiveness, here the two things are linked. And so why do I view it as a defense of Wall Street. And what I'm really saying, a defense of Wall Street, it's two things. It's an emphasis that a well-functioning financial system is very important for many dimensions of prosperity that a wide range of people would agree on. Not just growth, but many other things. Here, though, the shock is to finance. And it's a shock that makes the financial system more competitive, and a shock that makes the financial system work better. Other work sort of shows about the margins. And that's associated with all types of improvements. Now, if you want to take a step back and say that really what's underlying that is to make a financial sector better, you need competition. And so the essence really is competition. I'm okay with that. But I don't think, in fact, I know that if you go to the IMF, if you go to the World Bank, if you go to the Fed, if you go to other central banks or financial regulatory systems around the world, they won't be pushing for greater competition among banks as a mechanism for enhancing growth, lowering income inequality, and helping the poor. That's not what they're going to be thinking of when they think of financial regulation. But I don't think we disagree. Yeah, please.
Question. You haven't shown us any evidence that actually the competitiveness in the financial sector went up. This might be the case that actually there are just one single bank in each state that becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's it.
Very good. Okay, so the question is, you talk a big talk about this removal of impediments to competition actually increasing competition. Does it increase competition? So part of it is, I only wanted to have so many slides. So let me tell you what does happen. And this is why the measure you mentioned for competition is problematic and dynamic. So what happens is the U.S. had many, many banks, not because there was competition, because there was the local monopolies. So what you observe is lots of consolidation, because maybe what happens is Bill and I start competing. Bill is more efficient than I, so Bill takes over me. But you may think that you're better than Bill, and so you're willing to compete for this market. So the market becomes much more contestable. How do I know that? Because I mentioned, you do see profit margins shrink. You see deposit rates go up. You see lending rates come down. You don't see defaults going up either. So the banks seem to be getting better at what they're doing. Now, the reason why it's dynamic, and it may enter into what you're saying, is that is, I think, very much the case during the initial period of this deregulation. And I think what you may be pointing out is that the deregulation ends in 1995. Maybe there's still intensification of competition for another few years. But then the massive consolidation and where we're at now could be taking it in exactly the other direction. And I agree with that completely. Okay? I agree with that completely. And I think that if we get to the policy part, depending upon where questions go, and you want to come back and ask, I think that the reforms that the Fed has instituted are going to accelerate that process, have already accelerated that process, and may continue to accelerate this process, which will push things in exactly the other direction from what I'm analyzing here. So it is an empirical issue. But the point I want to make is that what I want to interpret this as is not that deregulation caused a better banking system that increased growth and income inequality. That would be the wrong interpretation. What I want to interpret it as is that this particular policy change and this particular point in the U.S. with all of the banks and how uncompetitive the banking system was increased competition in banking, and that was associated with these good things. Okay? Very good. Thank you. Okay. I applied this to racial discrimination for a variety of reasons. So I'll tell you about this. And this kind of comes back to, this is a little bit of a deviation, but I became very interested in the broader implications of finance, and maybe to a pathological degree, as Bill might point out. But, okay, so also it was very interesting for where I grew up. Doesn't matter. Okay, so almost a half a century after the civil rights movement, so supposedly we outlawed, the U.S. outlawed discrimination. The issue is that economists do a lot of estimates. You control for education, you control for this, you control for that. That's what I mean by counterparts. So counterparts, the goal here is that you get an African American and a white that have the same characteristics and they're working in the same industry in the same job. Whether they can do all of that perfectly is another matter, but that's sort of the goal of many labor economists, and you still find a 20% pay gap. So then the question is, why is that the case? One reason that's the case is that there's racial discrimination. Another reason that could be the case is that the econometrician and the statisticians are leaving something out that accounts for that 20%, and they just can't measure it, and it's not discrimination per se, it's something else that they can't capture. And this might affect policies as well, if you know what is causing it. So Gary Becker was a Nobel Prize winner, maybe one of the more influential economists ever. He had this view that there are different types of discrimination. So this is a discrimination of one particular type of discrimination. And he called it taste-based discrimination. So the issue here is if I'm a white employer, perhaps my tastes are, I just don't like hiring African American workers. And that's sort of like a pure kind of taste-based discrimination. Okay. Now, if you think about that, that means I'm willing to hire a white worker who's worse than a black worker that I could hire. Okay? That's the nature of that statement, which means that I'm willing to forego some profits in order to satisfy my prejudicial tastes. Okay? That's, I mean, not okay like, yes, you think that that's a good thing. Okay in the sense of, do you understand Gary Becker's argument about that? What Gary Becker argued was that, therefore, if you have lots of competition and you squeeze the profit margins of the racist employer, the racist employer won't necessarily change his or her attitudes, but will be forced to change his or her actions because they won't have the profits to forego. They're just going to have to hire the best workers or else they'll go out of business. Okay, so this is Becker's view. Now, of course, and this is sort of this is what. Therefore, if you see an intensification of competition, and there were racial prejudices beforehand, then you should see this reduction in the black-white wage gap. If you see an intensification of competition and there were no racial prejudices beforehand, and you believe Gary Becker, okay, then you won't see a change. Okay, so it's all, if you believe this argument, if it makes sense to you, it's also a way of evaluating how important racial attitudes are in the wage market. Good? Okay. So, no one had ever looked at this before. And I was actually sitting in a PhD class of a colleague of mine who's a labor economist, and he was teaching about this. He says, you know what the big problem is? The big problem is we can't find a shock to competition. And I'm like, oh, I have a shock for competition. There was this bank deregulation, right? And then we can see, did the shock to competition have an impact on racial wage disparities? So that's what the issue is. Did bank deregulation intensify competition in the non-banking sector? Other people had already shown that, so the answer to that is yes. What would be really nice is, for the experiment, not nice as a general thing, but really nice for the experiment, is that if there are measurable differences in racial prejudices across states, then I can see whether the same shock to competition has a differential impact on the racial wage gap the way Gary Becker predicted. Please.
Hidden dimensions
Okay.
of attitudes. In an empirical model,
Yep.
oftentimes they are never measured because they're unmeasurable.
Absolutely.
And so how then do you factor that in to an empirical system that is based on data?
Yeah. So, if I had to guess, imperfectly. So we have a couple of advantages over. So here's where part of it is going to be: is can we do things better than other people who've investigated this? So the other people who've investigated this in the U.S. have a difficult time because there's so many things going on in the country as a whole. The nice thing that we have is because this change in competition is going to differ by state and differ by year, we can do everything at a much more local level than others. So we can ask, we have individual level data, we're tracing people through time, we can control for things like their education, we can control for things like their parents' education, and we can control for whether there are differences in the black-white wage gap that differ by state. And then ask, after controlling for all of these things, did this shock have an independent effect? So we can't evaluate all of the potential influences on the racial wage gap. We can just say the best that we can do is there's a shock to competition. It's unlikely, and this is what everything depends on, it's unlikely that this shock to banking competition is taking place at the exact same year in states that some other shock that's affecting the black-white wage gap. So, because it's like, okay, Rhode Island deregulates in 1982, and then we're going to see what happens given that competition changes then. But then Montana deregulates in 1994. It's the same shock. Do we see a similar change? Now, if there were something that were happening in Rhode Island in 1982 and Montana in I can't remember the year I used, 1994, that was at the same time as some other explanation that was affecting racial wage gaps, that would mess us up. And so what we're going to bank on is that the bank deregulation and the shock to competition, it's taking place in different states in different years, probably not exactly the same other things changing at exactly that same time that affect.
So your controlling variable here is the bank, the deregulation.
Yep.
But the initial question that I have in terms of the overall, analysis here is, did you have banks that were headed by African Americans?
We can look at this in two different ways. Well, okay. So one is there's more competition among banks, and so one question might be, was there a change in discrimination within the banking industry? Doing that for African Americans in this time period, I think your skepticism is exactly right. There's not enough. There are not a sufficient number of banks owned by. There's not a sufficient number of banks owned by blacks, and even more importantly, I think that even much more importantly is that there's not good representation of blacks as employees within banking. We're asking something different. So we're saying is that when banks deregulated, this intensified competition among all of the firms. And so this goes back to sort of this is a little bit why I used it. This goes back to the Billy Bob example. So I'm a bank I'm facing more competition, I can no longer just lend money to Billy Bob. Okay? I can lend money to other firms. And that way I can look at all of the different industries. And that gives me, and then it becomes much more interesting. Okay, so then we need a measure of racial prejudices across states. So you can get measures, like there are survey measures. The problem with the survey measures is the survey measures we have occurred after the bank deregulation. It's hard to go back to the 1970s and get state-by-state measures of, survey measures of racial attitudes. So what we do is we look at intermarriage. So we can go back to the 1970 census, which is way before the bank deregulation starts. And we can ask, if you were to randomly match couples, kind of divide up the couples and randomly match them, how much intermarriage would you get? And we can use the difference between that random amount of intermarriage and the actual amount of intermarriage as some sort of a proxy of racial attitudes. It's certainly exogenous, I think, to what happens in banking. Okay. You can do this in a couple of different ways. And you could say, well, there are differences in education and other things. You can then start to become very complicated with this index and control for all of that and say, random, once you account for those differences, it doesn't matter too much. The first thing we need is that, did this increase in, did the bank deregulation cause an intensification of competition? The competition that we have here has to do with the entry of new firms. That's one way to measure competition. One thing that we need is there's two types of deregulation. They take place in different years. One type of deregulation is you allow banks within a state to branch. That's the Bill and Ross example. Another type of deregulation is you allow banks from another state to enter your state. That would also intensify competition. Those took place in different years in different states. So the 0 here is for the interstate, and then the 0, then when I look at the interstate ones, it's a different one. So the first thing you need is that, did the deregulation intensify competition both in high racial bias and low racial bias states? There's a little bit of difference, but you get an intensification of competition in both. Okay, this is important because the words of the econometrician, it's like, okay, we treat these states and we treat those states. Treating meaning that there's this shock to competition among firms in both states. Okay. And here what we have is, and this is where we just have to control for everything that we can. So the goal is to say that the way that this is done is you run a regression of log hourly wages for whites only. And you do this based on all of the things that you can think of that explain wages. And you get coefficients. And those coefficients are, here's how much wage you get for a certain amount of education. Here's how much age you get for a certain amount of experience. Here's how much extra wage you get for working in this industry, this occupation, this and that. Those coefficients come out of the white regression. Then you take the African Americans in the study and you know their traits, and you apply the coefficients to the African American population, and you get the projected wages, and then the difference is the wage gap. Okay, that's what it can't be explained with all of this other stuff. Okay. So this upward slope here is that there's an increase in blacks' wages relative to white wages when you get this intensification of competition. Is it suggesting that this is the only thing that can affect it? No, of course not. It's just because you just have this one little measure. You don't get it in states where there's high levels of racial intermarriage. Now, there may be other things going on, and this is not perfect, but it certainly is consistent with, one, racial prejudices having a big impact on wages. And there's this very simple type of racial prejudices. There are other types of racial prejudices as well. And where competition affects the relative wages where Gary Becker would have predicted they would. But please, go for it.
Just trivial detail, but so before zero on the say either chart, but on the left there, you see inter and intrastate roughly. But why is this? Why is it that afterwards then the intrastate is always consistently higher growth than the interstate? What's the difference?
It's I don't know. Maybe it. Yeah. Why I don't know. You know, they're both, and I don't. Why I don't know, and two, I would guess that they're not statistically significant. There's not significantly different, but I don't know.
Whereas most racist states all clustered and likely to reconcile from one region.
Clustered, but not all. So to put it differently, if we use a regional dummy, we still get this. Yeah. But they are clustered there.
Yeah. Given how we've been progressing and the social mores, I think it's not unreasonable to assume that if we take any year, the farther along we go, we find that racial anecdotes are less than, not to the extent we'd like. So my question is, if you change the year zero from the year which that state deregulated banking, if I say take a random year, won't I still get the same result?
No, because remember in here there's a separate dummy variable for every year. So if there's a general trend, we're getting rid of all that. This is everything is, and that's very important because here it looks like. So maybe there's two things. Here, one might draw the interpretation that, oh, the black-white wage gap went away once they deregulated banking. Not true. All it says is that this intensification of competition seemed to boost blacks' relative wages, where in the states that Becker would suggest, other things were going on such that you don't see these changes. Exactly. But the bigger point they want to make outside of the econometrics is that I am not saying anything about the overall trends in the racial wage gap. I'm just saying that an intensification of competition seemed to reduce the racial wage gap as predicted by a very influential hypothesis. Okay, takeaway points. I saw my son yesterday. He said, yeah, okay, you're going to blab forever, but just like, what do they have to remember? The most important thing that I've learned from working on all of this is because I don't really care too much about finance, even though I spend most of my waking life doing research on finance. I care about finance because how does this affect things that I am deeply concerned about, which is what's happening to human welfare, what happens to growth, what happens to economic opportunities, what happens to poverty, the discrimination. And so even if you don't care about finance at all, you don't want to know about regulations, if all you care about is economic development, which I think is a wonderful thing to only care about, I think you'll miss something important about what shapes people's lives if you don't pay attention to the financial regulations, financial policies, etc. Not so bad. So I'll stop. There's questions. I don't know if you have a question about policies or anything, whatever. Please.
One question regarding one of the critics that is usually made to the financial system in general is that to people of lower income, they usually, of course, for obvious reasons, they charge more greater interest rates to people of lower incomes, and that's one of the critics that it's made to the financial system, that it promotes inequality. So I don't know. What do you think about it? It's not that important, and it's still financial system. It's good for.
So yes. So the subtleties and the nuances are always kind of mess everything up, huh? So no financial system is perfect. that if you have more competition in finance, those price differences may tend to diminish if they're there for regulatory reasons. But the financial system is not going to eliminate all difficulties. There are problems, informational asymmetries. There are problems with evaluating people, their businesses, and therefore wealth is typically very important for the ability of somebody to get credit and financing. So the issue is that better functioning financial systems, I'll kind of do this better and worse, better functioning financial systems, wealth is going to be less important than in worse functioning financial systems. I think one of the big differences we see across countries, maybe not the biggest and not the most important, but I think very important, is that the importance of wealth of being able, in terms of getting credit in less developed countries, countries with less opportunities for growth, with greater income inequality, tend to be more severe than in richer countries that are growing faster. So I think it's one contributing factor, but the financial system's not perfect.
Well, for me, it's just when it comes to the broader policy implications of regulation or deregulation, I just want to understand, you saw the casino case or the other alternatives, and is it possible to have a system, a finance system, where you have common sense regulation that makes so we have a well-functioning finance structure that will, in a way, avoid events like the 2007, 2008 financial crisis? I'm not sure where you fall. Are you in favor of some kind of regulations that would mitigate some of these risks? Because based on that, some of the empirical evidence that we encountered in the past, and whenever I look at, you're right, finance can be good, but it can also be bad. So
how do you get the good without the bad?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I thought you might ask that. Let's see what to do first. That's all, folks. No, not that first. I think that there's this quote by James Madison in the Federalist Papers that I love, and I think it kind of answers a little bit your question. And it's why financial regulation and many other policies, but especially financial regulation, are so difficult. And that is, you need a very strong government for an economy to work well. Most of us really don't want to hang out in a place that has a weak government and weak enforcement of rights and law and order and things like that. And in finance, you need a powerful government to support property rights and to constrain excesses. At the same time, it's also true that once a very powerful government is created, it can abuse those powers. And around the world, governments abuse powers. And in the financial sector, this is done very intensively, where you get bonds between the officials, the regulators, and the bankers, where they're working against the common interest and for the elite. And they're doing everything possible to keep out opportunities in other people. Indeed, that was always the question. Well, if finance is so good, why don't more countries have better developed financial systems? And the answer is pretty clear, because the elite don't want a better functioning financial system, because a better functioning financial system means that other people can compete with them. So it becomes this very difficult tension between having a regulatory system that's strong enough to constrain excesses, while somehow being able to oblige the regulatory system not to become part of the problem. And that doesn't exist in too many places. So let me then give maybe you wanted something less, maybe you wanted something maybe more concrete. So more concrete. What would be a good financial system? So one is you want a financial system that has, we saw, competition and transparency. You have competition and transparency, you're more likely to have private investors being able to influence the financial sector so that it behaves well. So I think that there's a lot of evidence about the benefits of that. Let me drop to the second one. The other thing, there's a lot of evidence that if you have a very strong regulator, they will too often abuse that power. Okay, so they will put an influence on the financial sector to push the flow of credit to their political constituencies, not to the people at large. So there's also a fair amount of evidence that a regulatory system that's very interventionist creates massive problems as well. So you have this balance. You want the market to work, but you know you can't rely only on the market. You need a powerful regulator to stop abuses, but somehow you have to stop the regulator. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's always the same thing. The other thing is, and this is the problem if we were taking a step out of development, it's in the developing countries as well, but this is, I'm going to come back to this in the US and Europe, is you need to focus on the decision makers within banks. Who's making the decisions about the allocation of credit and the provision of services? Regulators very often don't focus on the incentives of the decision makers. Okay, this is the biggest problem. So what do I mean by this? And this is going to be hard to do in 1 or 2 minutes. But if I'm an executive in a bank, how am I paid? This differs around the world. If I'm executive in the bank and I'm in the US, I'm probably paid with an options contract, which means that if the bank does really well, I get a lot of money. Okay, so this creates incentives for me to take on whatever risks I need to take on to get that lot of money. If I get paid with a salary, I have different incentives, and then I really don't want the financial institution to fail. Okay, so those incentives matter a lot. Okay, so that's the executive. Now let's say the executive is different from the owner. Okay? So we have the corporate governance system. The executive is different from the owner. The owners, okay, they may not want too much risk because they have something to lose if the thing goes bankrupt. Then it depends. Do you have one big owner? Do you have lots of little owners? Okay, this also matters. If there's one big owner, he or she is going to be paying a lot of attention to what's going on in the bank. Okay? If you have shares in Citibank, okay, you don't have much of your wealth in Citibank, and you definitely don't have any influence over Citibank. So you're not going to watch too much what goes on in Citibank. Very different. So, and this differs around the world and by bank. And the same policy won't matter. You've probably heard a lot about capital regulations. Right? Capital regulations is you need to have more equity. You have more equity, there's less likely the thing to go bankrupt. Maybe, maybe not. You have more capital. If this comes from shareholders who have very little of their wealth in the bank, it's not going to change the incentives of the decision makers. They're too little. If it comes from the existing owner, then it can matter. So this is why this issue about the incentives of the decision makers is also very important. I think I could go through some of the different systems around the world, but I think those 3 things. If you have competition and transparency, if you have a regulatory regime that's not too invasive and that's focusing intensely on what are the financial motives of the decision makers in the banks. Okay? And it's that last one that very few regulators do, including the US. Things could go boom.
So I'm curious how you'd respond to this claim, but it sounds like you're making the argument essentially that under a well-regulated, well-functioning financial system that trickle-down economics should work. Is that an oversimplification?
I'm not so sure I don't know whether it's trickled down or not. And it has to be compared to what? So I don't know. I don't know 100% what trickle-down economics is. It has such a bad connotation, like we're going to go out and give a whole bunch of money to already rich people and hope that it trickles down to the poor. I wouldn't say that that's what the evidence is suggesting here. I think what it's suggesting here is that a better functioning financial system that does a better job of allocating resources and opportunities to those with the best ideas regardless of wealth, it does, to me, I wouldn't classify it like that. Now, you know, so I don't like that. But that may be more the advertising, but maybe you're right about the ultimate thing. Yeah. Sorry.
I was wondering if you had an opinion on the Dodd-Frank Act. Like,
terrible. Terrible. No, terrible. So it's the problem with Dodd-Frank is that, so you have to, okay, now we go to the U.S. So in the U.S., a large bank cannot have a big owner by regulation. Okay, so no bank has a large owner. Okay, they're all little owners. This means that the executive is the decision maker. You can think of the CEO as the decision maker. The CEO in all of these large banks is paid with an options contract. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, you have an options contract. The one thing we know about options contract is that you want to increase risk because the payoffs are enormous if you gamble and win. And if you gamble and lose, nothing happens. Okay, so this is like, for the economists, it's like there's this massive moral hazard problem. Good? Okay. Now, Dodd-Frank has two components, one of which is going to go away. It'll go away regardless of who the president is, but it's going to go away faster under the Trump administration. So one part, I'll probably say, is they slightly increased capital requirements. Okay, so they slightly increased how much of the bank has to be financed with equity rather than debt. But as I pointed out to you before, that has no impact, maybe even an adverse impact, on the incentives of the executive to take on risk, because you're not asking the executive to put more of his or her money on the line in the bank. The executive really has hardly any money, any of their money invested in the bank. Okay? So the executive still wants to take on risk, regardless of how much equity you have in there. So far, so good? Okay. Now, there's the one thing that was supposed to happen, which I think is a terrible thing for the reasons I mentioned earlier, which is that what we're going to have is massive government involvement in what the banks do. Now, that's not good because the government is not very good at allocating credit. But if you have all the other stuff, which means that you have too big to fail and all of these other policies that encourage the executive to take on risk, you better do something to constrain risk. I would prefer that you force the executive to put more of his or her financial wealth at risk. Dodd-Frank put more constraints on risk-taking. This is not necessarily, this is not the worst outcome. It's what they're doing in Europe. It'll probably prevent a major crisis. But the whole purpose of the talk today was like, yeah, but it doesn't promote prosperity. Because the government's not going to be too good at figuring out who the best people to lend are. And that's what the financial sector is supposed to do. Now, if we stop there, it would be bad, but not really bad. So just to leave on a nice pessimistic note, because I'm an economist, is that what is going to go away in as they whittle away Dodd-Frank? And this was going to whittle away. It didn't matter if it was a Democratic administration or Trump, but with Mnuchin, it'll go away quickly. Is what they're saying is, this is the U.S. We're market-oriented. We can't have all these restrictions on banks. Okay, I'm not for restrictions so much for the restrictions on the bank either, but if you have a system that encourages the executives to take on excessive risk, then you need restrictions on the executives, or you need the executives to have more of their wealth on the line. So the executives don't have more of their wealth on their line, and now what they're going to do is to remove the regulatory impediments to the executives taking on more risk. This cannot end well. Because one thing as an economist that we always come back to believing is we believe in incentives. So if you tell an executive, you can make an enormous amount of money if you gamble, but we're not going to penalize you if you lose, they're probably going to take an enormous gamble. That may succeed for a while, but not forever. And so I'm very nervous about the U.S. financial system.
Should we clap on that?
I don't know. Or boo, I don't know.